Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who don't know me, my name is John Piggott. I direct CEPAR, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here today. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the podium over to the director of the Crawford School, Professor Helen Sullivan, who has agreed to officially open the day's proceedings. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Crawford. Those of you who've not been before, I'm sure most of you have, and some of you will know us very, very well. As John says, I've the great privilege of being the current director of Crawford, and Crawford is a large and very well-known public policy school. I was just impressing upon one of our overseas speakers that we are the leading public policy school in the region, and we have the data to prove it, which is always something important to say in a room full of economists. So I just want to put that out there. But we're also a public policy school that is very engaged, as you would imagine, very engaged in the public policy issues of the day, both in Australia, which is particularly vexing, as you might imagine at the moment, but also in the region. It's a school which has a core, if you like, in economics, but also extends to public administration, politics, anthropology, geography. We really are a diverse school. So as we begin today's really, really exciting workshop, I wish I could stay for all of it, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and extend my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. The challenge that you're grappling with today, aside from the chairs, which hopefully you'll all have mastered by the end of the day, it's fine, is a really significant challenge. And it's a challenge that we have known is coming for a while, but is one that nonetheless requires our focused attention. And it is excellent that John and CEPAR are really taking this challenge on and have managed to bring together such an extraordinary group of experts to help us think through and also to come up with, as you would expect in a public policy environment, some practical proposals for what we might do to address the challenges that we face. Again, many of you will be familiar with CEPAR, but for those of you who aren't, CEPAR is now in its 8th year of funding from the Australian Research Council, which is an extraordinary achievement, as some of you may know from who actually gets to decide who receives Australian Research Council funding. It's not as clear-cut as we once thought. The Centre of Excellence is based at the University of New South Wales, with nodes here at the ANU, Curtin University, Melbourne, the University of Sydney. It's a centre that is focused on producing world-class research on population ageing and is a unique collaboration bringing together academia, government and industry to address one of the major social challenges of the 21st century. Their research is both rigorous and innovative, and it is aimed at providing global solutions to the economic and social challenges of population ageing and building a new generation of researchers to global standard with an appreciation of the multidisciplinary nature of population ageing. And that combination of both developing policy capability but also building the next generation of researchers is vitally important, both to public policy but also to public policy schools like ours who seek to help develop the next generation, both of public policy scholars but also of practitioners. And I think in an environment where we are constantly under challenge as experts to demonstrate both the legitimacy of our position but also the impact that we might have, days like today are a really important expression of how we can bring together very different sorts of expertise in the service of addressing a pretty significant question. I know that John has assembled a range of extraordinary speakers today, and my task is simply to welcome you and to introduce the chair of the first panel, Jenny Gordon, who again is somebody well known to us here at Crawford, but also to the ANU. and a very well-established economist in her own right. Previously with the Productivity Commission, she is now the principal economist at Nous Consulting Group, and has done that thing that many of us wish we could do, which is to span academia, practice, and also now dipping her toe into the world of consulting. So, Jenny, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen. It's a pleasure to be here today and involved in cepar events, which I have been over the years in my role as Principal Advisor at Productivity Commission. I was involved in the aged care report, so it's a topic that's pretty dear to my heart. My job really is to introduce the panel and to encourage you all to ask very good questions. We have a presentation first from David Knox, who actually, I was at Macquarie University with many, many years ago when he was in the actuarial department and I was a fledgling economist. But it's a sign of our age, I think, the grey hair. So he's a senior partner at Mercer and a senior actuary in Australia. He's been involved with superannuation and developed the Melbourne Mercer Global Pension Index, which has just been, the 2018 has just been released, and I recommend you go and have a look at it. This actually ranks income retirement systems globally, and Australia does reasonably well, but we're falling down on the scale, and I'm sure David's going to take us through why and what that consists of. So he was a Professor at Actuarial Studies at University of Melbourne and a Director of PwC Actuarial, and I think we're really looking forward to hearing what he has to say about something, looking at the average age in this room, we're probably all rather concerned about. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and thank you for that welcome. There we go. And I am going to look at the Australian system, but I'm going to start by looking at where we rank globally on the Melbourne Mercer Global Pension Index. And on the slide, you will see there are sort of three logos, which might be a little bit confusing. The index started 10 years ago when the Victorian government funded the first index in 2009, which covered just 11 countries. We've gradually expanded that to 34 countries this year. So hence the Melbourne logo. We do it in cooperation with the Australian Centre for Financial Studies, which has morphed into under various banners over the years, but is now part of the Monash Business School, and hence the Monash logo, and of course the Mercer logo. So what are we trying to do here? We are trying to look at financial security in retirement. What sort of levels of income do people get? What are the threats? And what can we learn from other countries? Now, when we started 10 years ago, we had to have a framework. What do we look at? How do we start? I mean, we could start anywhere. What we decided to do was to look at the World Bank multi-pillar model. It's a 5-pillar model. The OECD has a 3-pillar model. You can argue the toss about multi-pillars, but basically what this model does is say there are various sources of income and financial support in retirement. Pillar 0 is the base pension for the poor, poverty alleviation, if you like. We have that in Australia with our means-tested pension. Pillar 1 we don't have in Australia. That is social security, earnings related, common in Europe, the US, etc. Pillar 2, a compulsory system, like our SG, fully funded in the private sector. Pillar 3 is when people choose to top up their pensions. Again, fully funded in the private sector. Pillars 2 and 3 are really our superannuation system. But Pillar 4 is important. Pillar 4 is what happens outside government pensions and the private pension. It might be savings, it might be home ownership, it might be family support. That is all part of security in retirement. So what we decided to do 10 years ago is to try and ask questions about each pillar and find out what's working well and what's not working so well around the world. A little bit more than half the value of the index in each country comes from international data. OECD, World Bank, United Nations, IMF, etc. A little less than half comes from answers or questions we ask our Mercer colleagues in each country around the world. And that is what's unique about this index. So we can ask questions about governance issues. I'll give you a very simple example. Is it a requirement that your private pension systems are audited? Now, to my mind, the answer is an obvious yes. They should be audited. I thought that was a gimme question, bonus point almost, until we got to South Korea. And the answer is no. So as we expand the index to more countries, we will get more developing economies where the governance and regulation structure is not as strong as it should be. And that's a good finding. Similarly, we ask questions about conflicts of interest policy and so on. Okay, so what are the questions we ask? We ask three fundamental questions. We ask about the benefits you get out of the system, the adequacy, if you like, whether it's from government or the private pension system. What benefits do you get? What rules or design issues are there? For instance, we ask a question about preservation. In Australia, except for very special conditions, we can't access our superannuation before we retire. When I left my first job many decades ago, I got my superannuation withdrawal benefit. I took the cash, I bought a new car. That car is no longer, and I'm still working. I leave you to draw the conclusions. And yet, leakage from the system is common in some countries, the US, South Africa, just to give you two examples. So we ask questions about benefit design as well as size of benefits. Then we ask questions about sustainability. The pension system is not there just for next year or the year after. It's there for decades to come. Is it sustainable? Can it keep delivering? And there is a natural tension between adequacy and sustainability. I'll just look at Greece as an example. Their benefits were very generous from age 55, but it was clearly not sustainable. So what you want in a good system is both good benefits and long-term sustainability. Can a system deliver both? We'll find out. And the third type of question we ask is about, can you trust the system? Will you know your money will be invested properly and still be there when you retire in 20 years' time? Is there integrity in the system? Whether that's, can you trust the government? It's an interesting question. That opens up all sorts of public policy questions, but there's certain questions around integrity in the private system which we concentrate on. So we've broken the index down into those three broad areas with slightly different weightings, and those weightings haven't changed over the 10 years. As I said, it covers 34 countries now, or should I say 34 systems, because we've added Hong Kong this year, and Hong Kong is not a country, being part of China. So we just had to modify our language a little bit to make sure we compare systems and not countries. Okay, so let's have a look at adequacy. What do we do here? We look at the base pension, what do you get if you're poor. We look at the net replacement rate for an average income earner throughout the system. We look at various benefit design questions like vesting and preservation, which I've touched on, and even portability. Can you move your funds as you change jobs? We look at the issue of savings outside super, household savings, and indeed household debt, because if you have household debt, you're going to have to pay that off sometime, and that's probably going to affect your retirement income adequacy. And we look at growth assets. Now, growth assets mean things like equities and property. Why don't we look at the investment return? We'd love to look at long-term investment return of the system in each country, but that's not available. What is the investment return of the Chinese pension system? I don't have a clue, and I'm not sure they do either. So we look at growth assets as a proxy for that. We're not suggesting people put 100% in equities, but funds that only, or countries, systems that only put 10 or 20% in equities have a bit of a penalty because that investment return will be lower and that will affect adequacy. I should add that this report is fully downloadable, free of charge on the web, so if you want to, don't have to take lots of notes, but obviously we're open to questions. Okay, who's got the best systems in terms of adequacy? We go to Europe. Germany, France and Ireland. Where does Australia rate? Middle of the pack, 16th out of 34, almost dead median, if you like, for those statisticians. And down the bottom, Hong Kong, India and Mexico. That's probably not surprising, but they're at the bottom. Let's now look at sustainability. Sustainability, we look at things like what proportion of the working age population are in private pensions, as opposed to just relying on the government. What level of assets have you set aside for the future as a proportion of your GDP? Demographic issues, ageing populations, even fertility rates, because if you're not having babies, you're going to age a lot quicker. And we don't worry about migration because that's a very fraught, difficult area. And we try and rely on objective data rather than subjective opinions. Labour force participation rate for those at older ages, 55, 64, 65 plus, because if we're working a bit longer, we're more sustainable. Net government debt as a proportion of GDP. If you've got debt, and some countries have very high debt, then your social security system, your future pensions are under threat. Can they be afforded in decades to come? And we also look at real economic growth, because what we're saying is if the economy is growing in real terms, you're more likely to have higher investment returns, lower unemployment, general growth. That will make the whole system more sustainable. So which systems are most sustainable? Denmark, Netherlands, Australia in third spot. A fair bit behind the Netherlands, but nevertheless a good result in terms of sustainability. Down the bottom, we go back to Europe, Spain, Austria and Italy. I'll show you a graph in a moment how you balance adequacy and sustainability, but those three countries I think have significant long-term issues. When we then look at integrity, we worry about issues of regulation, governance, are members' benefits protected? What happens if there's a fraud, for instance, in the pension system? Do you have to communicate with your members? And a proxy for costs in the overall system. Okay, who comes out well here? Finland, Norway and the Netherlands. Where's Australia fit? Fourth, just outside the top three. And the bottom, again, emerging economies, China, Argentina and Mexico. So I haven't given you all the data. You haven't been able to do all the multiplications and additions and weighting and all that, so I better put up the results so you see which countries do well. We have two A-grade systems in my view, the Netherlands and Denmark. This year the Netherlands beat the Danes by 0.08. Last year the Danes beat the Netherlands by 0.08. Spring Racing Carnival in Melbourne, I'd say there's a nose in it. There's not much in it. They're the two best systems in the world in my view. And there's a significant gap, if you look at the bars, to Finland in third spot. Australia, fourth out of 34, not bad, but I'll have a look at our results in a moment. Then we go down to Sweden, Norway, Singapore and Chile. US, just as a matter of interest, is virtually in the middle, C grade, but a fair bit of work to do. And down the bottom, a number of emerging economies, Argentina, India, Mexico, China, Korea and Japan. Japan, a developed economy, very significant government debt, ageing fast, benefits are not all that good, and that's why they're there. So what this does is it actually gives us and policymakers topics for discussion. It's really interesting to see how that's been used around the world over time as governments, policymakers, etc., compare themselves. And we expect some countries like Great Britain to gradually move up the scale as their auto-enrolment system takes hold, more people are covered, more assets, higher contributions. Okay, this is the graph that compares adequacy and sustainability. Notice up the top where you'd like to be, good benefits and sustainable, Denmark and the Netherlands. Here we have Italy, Austria and Spain. Reasonable benefits, very heavily reliant on government social security, almost no private pensions. And that is a bit like Greece coming along. It can't keep happening. Down the bottom here, A number of emerging economies, not surprising, currently relatively poor benefits, but they will improve over time. Okay, that's the big picture. Let's now have a look at some comparisons with Australia. And what I've done here is I've taken countries that are in the top half dozen or so, and I've also included in comparisons countries we like to compare ourselves with, Anglo-Saxon countries, if you like, US, UK, Canada, and New Zealand. So, first comparison is the net replacement rate. Now, this is a calculation by the OECD that takes an average income earner joining the workforce at 20, working their way through full-time career, admittedly that's got limitations, but that's what they do, through to the pension age, and see what income in retirement they will get after tax, if you like, a net replacement rate. Now, the Netherlands has a score above 100%, which I think is too generous, or virtually 100% for an average income earner. What I've done in that graph, I've looked at, there are two bars. The first bar is the calculation in 2015 done by the OECD. The darker colour bar is 2017. And you can see the Australian score has dropped considerably over a 2-year period, as has Norway. The others have just moved a little bit, which is not surprising. The primary reason for the Australian score to drop is the stronger assets test that was introduced in January 2017. Because what we're looking at here is an average income earner entering the workforce now, SG going to 12%, that's what's legislated. What have they got at the end? Convert that to an income stream, they'll get very little age pension now under the stronger assets test. Previously, when the assets test was $1.50 per thousand, they were getting some age pension. That drop is purely because of the stronger assets test. Okay, so let's have a look at the means tests around the world in some of these countries. What I've done here is shown the taper, if you like, or the means test as a retiree gets more and more income expressed as a percentage of the average wage. So if you have no income, 0%, then you get a means tested income. As your income increases on the x-axis, you get less means tested pension. Now, in most of these countries, that line is a 45-degree line. In other words, it's dollar for dollar. For every dollar you earn, you lose $1. Now, that might seem a bit harsh under the Australian conditions where we have 50 cents for the dollar. But what it means is that the means tested pension is focused on the poor, and the middle income earners who might be earning, let's say, the average wage and have a retirement income of 50 to 60% are not affected by the means tests at all. So in fact, these people have got an incentive to save because the means test cuts out around the 35, 40% of the average wage. Now, we might argue that dollar for dollar is too tough, but I find that a really interesting outcome. What does Australia look like? I've repeated the same graph on the left-hand side, and here is Australia and Denmark. Denmark is interesting. It has half its pension as universal, 17% of the average wage, everybody gets. The other 17% is means tested at a fairly slow taper, about 35%. Australia has two tests, as we all know. The assets test, very tough, at in effect 7.8% or per thousand, and in fact is a steeper taper than dollar for dollar. The blue line is the income test, which is 50 cents in the dollar. I couldn't combine the two, it was too difficult to put the two tests on the one line. But I think it highlights two things. One, the toughness of the assets test. Secondly, the income test hurts people out here in what I'll call middle Australia. Whereas in many countries, middle income earners are not affected. So I think what's happening is our means test is actually providing a disincentive for middle Australia to save. We can talk about that over time, but I think there's a real issue there. Another issue we need to look at is coverage. What proportion of the working age population are in private pensions? Now, we do pretty well, we think, with compulsory super. Our coverage is a little bit under, around 75%. Netherlands, Finland and Sweden are up in the 80s. We've got other countries below us with a non-compulsory system, which is not surprising, the US, etc. We need to do something about coverage. And what I mean by that is the self-employed, gig workers and casuals. We need, in my view, we need to get rid of the $450 threshold, which brings casual into it. I have two daughters, one aged 20, one aged 30, one at uni in a part-time workforce, one in the full-time workforce as an almost gig worker. Both of them are losing SG because of the $450 threshold in some of the jobs they do. And it's not that they don't have a super fund, they do. They get super for some work, but not other work. That just doesn't make sense. So I think we need to tackle the whole issue of coverage and try and improve our coverage beyond that up towards near the Scandinavian countries. What about pension ages? Well, this graph shows the current pension age, pension eligibility age, and where it's projected to be in 2035. You see a number of countries, including Australia, are moving that age. Currently we're at 65.5, moving to 67. I think we need to adjust that age in line with life expectancy. Denmark, Netherlands and Italy all have a process to automatically adjust it with life expectancy. How you adjust it, we can debate, but let's put it out of the political arena and have some form of process or automatic adjustment. Inevitably, those ages are going to have to gradually increase with appropriate warning. That raises the issue of the preservation age, currently moving to 60. I think that probably needs to increase as well. So, recommendations for Australia. Pretty obvious. I think the assets test needs to be moderated. Do we need to think about a single means test? All those other countries have one test. We have two. And that complicates the issue. So, well, you ask, what about the holiday home? Shouldn't that be part of the test? Sure. But you can deem income on the holiday home at 4 or 5% or whatever it might be. So you've got, even if you don't receive the income, it's taken into account. And I would suggest in due course the main residence needs to be added as well. But that's a really hot political potato. Not just yet, but we might move to that. Is a part universal pension feasible? I'd like to suggest it is. Denmark's system is half and half. I would have thought if we give everybody above the pension age a part pension and maybe the concession card, that simplifies the system and gives everyone a base to work from. Expensive? Yes, but if you look at the OECD numbers, our costs are one of the lowest in the OECD. Controversial, I know. We need to broaden superannuation coverage. I've alluded to that with the self-employed, gig workers, etc. People are increasingly going to have a portfolio of jobs and not a main employer, and the 450 threshold. We also need to link our ages to life expectancy. I've talked about that. We need to introduce requirements for an income stream. And the government's announcement yesterday on CIPRs is welcome. We're still moving towards CIPRs. It will take time, it needs to be done properly, but income needs to be the focus of our super system, not lump sums. And finally, we need to continue to encourage people to work a bit longer. Our labour force participation rates at older ages have increased. They continue to need to rise. Interestingly, in 55 to 64 age group, our participation rate is 10 percentage points lower than New Zealand. Why? I don't know the answer to that, but it's an interesting outcome and we need to explore that issue. So there are a few topics. If I conclude by saying Australia still has a good system. It's 4th out of 34, so I don't want to blow everything up. I don't want to get rid of it, but I think we can improve it so there's a better outcome for our employees and those who are heading into retirement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I think that's giving us a lot to think about and a lovely list, actually. I'd now like to introduce Darren Kennedy. Darren's the Principal Advisor with the Retirement Incomes Policy Division at Treasury, so he might be a good person to ask about where we're going to go on all those various things that David put up. He has been in Treasury since 1999, and he was involved in the financial systems inquiry, so we'll probably take a fairly interesting perspective on a Treasury perspective, perhaps, on how we think about retirement incomes policy and how much government should pay and how much individuals should pay. Over to you, Darren.
Thanks, Jenny. Just while I pull this up, thanks to everybody who flew here this morning. It's great to come to an event like this and not have to get up at 4 a.m. Thanks, David, for a terrific presentation and for taking on the very difficult task of comparing pension regimes around the world. Anyone who's ever dipped their toe into that field knows just exactly how challenging that task is. And I think it is useful to take stock of where our system's at and what we can learn from other jurisdictions. So I thought I'd start with the good news from David's presentation, and that is the fact that we've ranked in the top 4 in the world for our retirement income system. I think to be ranked in the top 4 in the world in any area of public policy is a great achievement, and I think that is a strong endorsement of our policy settings and, is that better? Of our policy settings and our system as a whole. So I think that outcome reflects the many strengths that we know are part of our retirement income system in Australia. So of course there are areas for improvement, there always are. David threw a few ideas out there which no doubt will be the subject of a rich discussion. So I think for the remainder of my comments, I thought I'd focus on a couple of things. So first of all, what the government is doing in this space, and the government's actually doing quite a few things. I'll be reasonably brief with my comments there. And then I thought I'd come back to the issue of adequacy, which was one of the sort of key topics that David touched on in his presentation. So the budget. So in the budget this year, the government announced a wide-ranging package of initiatives under the banner of more choices for a longer life. So that package as a whole supports a number of the policy directions that David has touched on this morning. So first, there's a package that it includes financial checks for 45 and 65-year-olds. So that I think could be quite a useful reflection to hold a mirror up to people and they can see where they stand at, say, age 45, while there's still an opportunity to change tack if they need to realise their own goals. Secondly, there's a number of initiatives that go to increasing workforce participation by older workers. So that's certainly a goal that the government strongly supports. And there's a number of initiatives both on the supply and the demand side. So both encouraging employers to employ mature age workers and also encouraging people to remain in the workforce by allowing them to keep more of their age pension when they remain in the workforce. Thirdly, there's a group of measures that go to boosting living standards in retirement. And I might just spend a bit more time on this. The first one is an expansion of the pension loan scheme. So for those who aren't familiar with the pension loan scheme, it's an existing scheme that allows part-age pensioners to top up their pension to the full-age pension. And that top-up payment is essentially a reverse mortgage that's claimed from your principal residence when you ultimately sell that residence. So the government is extending the pension loan scheme to all people above age pension age, including full pensioners. So if you're a full age pensioner and you're asset rich and income poor, you can increase your age pension payments by up to 50%, with that top-up payment again essentially being a reverse mortgage provided by the government. So that's an initiative that's potentially of a lot of interest to people who are asset rich and income poor, but also I think it's something that can give a lot of confidence and reassurance to retirees more generally, even if you don't plan to use a scheme like that, to know it's there if you do need additional income in retirement or there are unexpected events that arise and you do need to tap into your home equity. The second thing I was going to touch on is retirement incomes. So we'll just jump to this slide here. So the government has announced in the budget its retirement income framework, and the cornerstone of this is the retirement income covenant. So the covenants are the high-level obligations on superannuation trustees. So there's a requirement at the moment for trustees to have an investment strategy for their members. There's a requirement for trustees to have an insurance strategy, but there's currently no requirement for superannuation trustees to have a retirement income strategy on behalf of their members. So this is something I think there's very broad support across from stakeholders for, and the government's sort of committed to that outcome. As David touched on, the Minister yesterday announced that as part of the retirement income framework, the government will also require all superannuation funds to offer a CIPA to their members from 2021. That's an extension of time from what the government had previously foreshadowed to give funds more time to develop new products and bring new products to market. So for those who haven't heard of a CIPA, it's a hybrid retirement income product that, for example, might be comprised of an account-based pension paired with a longevity product that will manage individuals' longevity risk. But I think the real potential for a CIPA is its ability to increase the standard of living for retirees in retirement. So if we jump to this chart here, you can see the green line, which is an account-based pension drawn at minimum rates. That's the product that a majority of people currently use in retirement and their current drawdown. And you can see this example CIPA, which is, has 80% in an account-based pension and 20% in a deferred life annuity, offers a significant boost to the level of private income in retirement. Now, we've known that for a period of time. The government also announced in the budget the age pension means test treatment for longevity products. So we now know what that chart looks like for your entire retirement income, inclusive of the age pension, which is the bottom chart below. And once again, we now see that these products have, again, the potential to really provide a significant uplift in total income in retirement. So I'll jump back. The last thing I thought I'd touch on, which is an announcement from the budget, is the Protecting Your Super package. So we know from multiple reports, including the Productivity Commission report and the FSI, that multiple accounts are a significant drag on retirement balances. In Treasury, we receive a lot of correspondence from people whose super account has been eroded to zero by fees and charges. So the government announced its Protecting Your Super package to protect small and inactive accounts from erosion. Now, there's a number of elements to this package. I won't go through all of them, but the effects of it are quite profound. So this package will save 7 million people more than $500 million in fees and will reunite around $6 billion, that's $6 billion of unclaimed or inactive superannuation with members' current active accounts. So that's 3 million people will have $6 billion of unclaimed super reunited with their current account. So these are really quite profound amounts. And again, this sort of goes to the point of trying to improve balances at retirement. So now I'll just return to the point of adequacy, which was one of the elements that David touched on in his presentation. So David presented an OECD chart that compared, replacement rates across countries using the OECD methodology, and it had a pretty low replacement rate for Australia. So in the Treasury, we believe that the OECD analysis understates the level of adequacy in the Australian system. And that's not to say there's any flaws in the analysis. I think international comparisons are difficult and different assumptions will always have different effects on different jurisdictions. But there are two key assumptions the OECD uses that are pretty critical here for the Australian system. So the first one is that the OECD compares last year in work and first year in retirement, as that's what's been measured. And I think that's fine if the first year of income is representative of your entire income in retirement. And that's certainly the case in Europe, where defined benefit funds are prominent. But that's not necessarily the case in Australia. If I jump to this chart here again, you can see from this green line here looking at total income, the total income in the first year is not representative of your income throughout retirement. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that we index our age pension to wages, not to CPI. So there is that sort of built-in growth in real age pension over time. And the second feature is the means test, which David also touched on. The second key assumption that kind of helps drive that OECD result is the rate of return. So the OECD assumes rates of return of 5.5% per annum in accumulation for all countries. But we know Australia has a higher allocation to growth assets than other countries, and that assumption for our defined contribution system really makes a big difference. So we know long-term rates of return in Australia are well above 5.5%, and therefore the OECD methodology will underestimate retirement balances balances at retirement. The last point I'll make, and this is just about sort of analyses of adequacy generally. Some analyses of adequacy, how you draw down money in retirement matters, right? And some of these analyses will use minimum drawdowns as a basis, and quite legitimately, because that's what most people do in retirement, is draw down their balance at minimum rates. But again, we can see from these charts, the minimum rates don't represent the potential income you can have in retirement. They represent the minimum level of income you can have in retirement. So your potential retirement income is potentially much higher than that guide might suggest. So Treasury has published our own replacement rates in the past. We do tend to focus more on the median person rather than the average, but there's obviously there's a range of people you can look at, but I think the data that we've put out in the past for both the median and the average, I think both of those are well above the OECD benchmark rate, which is 70%. Finally, I thought I'd just touch on the age pension means test, which was also one of the elements that David raised, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but the government's changes a couple of years back were done in a way that really improved equity in the system. So what the government did was it increased the free area, which provided an increase in age pension for those at the lower end of the part pension spectrum, and it increased the taper rate, which adversely affected those at the sort of higher level of assets. Overall, I think 90% of pensioners at the time were actually better off or no worse off from those changes. So there was actually a very positive equity effect from those changes. So in considering other policy options about the means test, I think you want to be mindful that you don't reverse some of those very positive equity effects that we've benefited from. And of course, I think the other thing to keep in mind is, with any sort of discussion about the taper rate, is what the fiscal consequences were. And that was, of course, one of the drivers for the changes the government made. There are a lot of demands on the budget at the moment, and it's not easy, to find ways to fund some of these changes. And I guess that kind of goes to the trade-off that David did mention. There is a trade-off between adequacy and sustainability, and that's kind of core, I think, to the age pension means test. So I thought I'll stop there, and I look forward to comments and discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Darren. Always good to get the government's perspective on some of these things, isn't it? I'd now like to introduce Peter Whiteford, who is a professor here at the Crawford School of Public Policy, and he's also a CEPA Associate Investigator. He was with the Social Policy Research Centre at New South Wales University between 2008 and 2012. I won't go into all the things he's done. He's done an awful lot of work at the OECD and covers a whole range of issues on income distribution and the policies that impact on that. So, Peter, thank you. Do you have slides?
No.
No.
Okay. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to focus on some of the adequacy issues, in particular in relation to the age pension. And I think I'm going to start off with the observation that Australia has a very unusual system. So we're the only OECD country in which the only part of our first pillar is income tested. As David has pointed out, other countries do have quite significant income testing components, or in some cases, they test your occupational pensions against your earnings related to pension against the minimum. But we're the only OECD country that income tests the whole thing. Now that has a lot of implications, and one of I think the main implications of that is some of the public debate and the conceptualisation of what are the objectives of the system. So in Australia, we have a lot of historical reference to the virtues of our targeted system are that we direct assistance to those most in need. But we also have this idea that that we need to make sure the system doesn't get too expensive, and that we keep up that adequacy through our means testing system. And as I said, I think it leads us to, in Australia anyway, to think about the objectives of the system in a slightly different way from the rest of the world. Now, because in most countries, a large element of the retirement income package that people are anticipating is based on the idea that I've contributed throughout my working life, and therefore, even if it's a government scheme that is actually not fully funded by your contributions, that it's something you've paid for in advance. Now, the fact that we don't necessarily have that perspective in Australia has both advantages and disadvantages. And some of the disadvantages are that we tend to have this discussion about age pension as if one of our most important objectives is to minimise how much we spend. Now, as David has pointed out, we have a relatively inexpensive cash payment system. I think the last figures I saw for the OECD is that we had the fourth lowest spending on age pensions of any OECD country, and projections are by the middle of the century, we'll have the third lowest level of age pension spending. So, you know, it will rise, but it will still be, in relative terms, a lot more sustainable. But this issue about targeting and the discussion about targeting, even though I've written quite a lot about this in my career, I think we have to be careful about how we think about it in terms of what are the objectives of the age pension system. Now, to some extent, for somewhat different reasons, I agree with the observation about replacement rates. I think even relative to before the points that have just been made, when the OECD or anybody else calculates replacement rates, they don't take account of the fact that a large part of the pension system in many countries is paid for by employers' social security contributions, and employers' social security contributions do not appear in income surveys. They do not appear in the calculation of replacement rates. So the absolute adequacy of age pensions in Australia is greater than the relative adequacy, but also we are a rich country. So there are degrees of complexity about replacement rates that should be borne in mind. The other thing I think that's very important to think about in relation to age pensions is that what are we trying to achieve through this first pillar? Now, I think I would disagree with the idea, as I said, we have a unique system, so I would disagree with the sort of World Bank idea that we should aim only for a minimal pension system. I think what we need to think about is what is the balance between adequacy at the bottom and going up the income distribution, and the issues of cost and sustainability. Now, this I don't think the Department of Social Services has in its statistics online published for a fair number of years actually the proportion of people who have no income apart from the pension, but I think it's under 10%. There could be somebody here who can contradict that. There's also a significant number of, there's actually a larger number of people whose incomes place them below the free area. So even though they have some other income, they're getting the maximum rate of pension. But if you extend upwards, I think currently, if you just look at the age pension system, between 60% and 2/3 of the population over the age of 65 are receiving some age pension. Now, as we go forward, if you look at the Treasury intergenerational reports, that proportion who are receiving a part-rate pension is not going to change all that significantly. What will happen is that more people will be getting a part rate rather than a full rate. That's the effect of the superannuation guarantee. So we have a very significant number of people who are in the income test range. And for those people, the level of the basic age pension is a pretty fundamental determinant of how well off they're going to be in retirement. When you look at our system being income tested, as I said, it actually has, it favours people whose lifetime incomes are low over people who have sort of the more conventional assumption, anyway, of a full-time permanent job for 30 or 40 years. Now, the sorts of groups our system favours are, as I said, people who do not have full employment histories. Now, the most disadvantaged are people who, say, for example, have a lifetime disability and have very limited participation in the workforce or people who have experienced long-term unemployment. The largest group, of course, of people who have relative disadvantage in the labour force in terms of their lifetime earnings are women. So there's a very important gender dimension of the adequacy of the age pension. And also there's an issue to do with migrants. If you have a system that's based on 40 years of contributions and migrants have been in a country for 20 or 30 years rather than 40 years, they'll end up with a lower occupational arrangement than people who've been here all their working lives. So I think that in thinking about the basic age pension, we need to think about what are the fundamental adequacy objectives we're trying to achieve. I would tend to think that I take the point about the changes in the assets test. I mean, there are other people in this room I know who have done work on this. When the Howard government reduced the assets test taper rate, I think at the time interest rates were about 7 or 8%. So it was incredibly generous at that time because whereas when the government increased the assets test taper, interest rates are not 7 or 8%. I think potentially we may have overshot on that, which raises the issue of whether the assets test taper should actually be flexible to relate to what people can actually earn in their investment income. The other issue related to some of the points David made is that raising the pension access age or the retirement age is fine for a lot of people like us in this room. I hesitate with Helen, my boss here, saying, I could keep working for a very long period of time without any adverse health consequences, right? That doesn't apply to everybody. If we raise the age pension age to 70, currently, on average, Indigenous men don't live that long. So that there's an equity issue that needs to be considered. Now, the way, we need to raise life expectancy for Indigenous men, and that doesn't have anything to do with the pension, but particularly there are other issues to be addressed. But we also need a pretty robust alternative for people who can't continue working. We have a disability support pension. The evidence is, say, for example, before the pension age for women was raised from 60 to 65, something like 60% of women aged 60 to 64 were getting an age pension. There are now no women of that age receiving an age pension, but there are about 20% receiving a disability support pension, whereas in the early 1990s, there were virtually no women receiving a disability support pension because they were sort of mutually exclusive. So we have to think about the continuing adequacy of disability support pension, and the age health gradient, age disability gradient is relatively strong. So while raising the age pension age for people like me is, not that I'm anticipating getting an age pension, is pretty reasonable. I think that particularly for low-income workers, we're going to have a reliable alternative source of income if we want to maintain equity. So, as I said, I think that I'll just conclude again with the observation that the fact that we income test the system actually, and that's our only basic first pillar, leads us into all sorts of complexities that don't necessarily apply in the same way in other countries. And so I think that thinking about the proper design of how that first pillar interacts with everything else is very important. One of the disadvantages of, say, for example, increasing the targeting, so increasing the withdrawal rate on age pensions is, when you think about it, is for a lot of people, it's compulsory for workers to have 9.5% of their earnings put aside during their working life, so long as they're above the $450 a month threshold. If we increase the age pension withdrawal rate to 70, or as the Commission of Audit proposed, or the 100%, what we're doing for a certain segment of low-income workers is saying, put aside this money during your working life, and then when you retire, you won't get much benefit from it. So I think thinking through the interaction between income testing and the adequacy of payments, and particularly how it affects disadvantaged groups, is a very important component of the debate we have to have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Invite our panellists to the podium or the floor. Lots of challenges. I just made a quick list. I think one of the interesting ones is the decline in return on assets that we've been seeing. So are we going to, if Treasury policy is based on the assumption that on average you'll get 7% or so. So that's a question that we could put on hold. There's a very strong interaction between access to the pension and access to the healthcare card. Healthcare card's actually worth an awful lot to people as well. So you are going to do a lot, which is why we don't expect to see that big decline in part pension. A lot of behaviour around there. Some really interesting challenges around just the demographic shifts. The numbers bandied around are going from 5 working age people to 1 dependent to more like 2.5 working age people, or even 2 to 1 dependent. So you can't really expect the young to pay taxes. And I heard this wonderful story once where people said, well, that's all right. They can pay 70% tax rate because they'll have such a higher income. But I think we know that they won't pay 70% tax rate, even if their incomes are commensurately higher. Treatment of the home, David raised that and Peter raised it as well, and how that interacts with things like funding aged care too. And the huge diverse array of models we've got for moving into retirement housing, and how much that and the models that they're using are driven by the way the tax system and the pension system are constructed. I don't think we've even got our heads around those models yet. I'm glad Peter mentioned gender, the adequacy, particularly for older women. And as we move into a higher share of the population hitting retirement age being renters. We've been talking a lot about people who have a home, but you actually have a whole bunch. And, you know, the exemption of the family home compared to the asset exemption you get on pension means that renters are treated very differently to homeowners in this country. So there's a whole bunch of really good issues. I don't know whether any of my panellists want to pick up on any of those before we start, or whether there are burning questions from the audience. Maybe I'll go to Peter. Do you want to pick up on any of those? Okay.
I'm good, thank you.
You okay?
I just make a comment that I absolutely agree with Peter in the sense of wherever that pension age moves, we have to have a strong disability support pension for those whose bodies are worn out before that age. Absolutely agree with that. But that happens at whatever age you pick, whether it's 60, 65 or 70, there'll always be people who are worn out before that age. So absolutely agree that we need an integrated system in that space, and I wasn't suggesting that blue-collar workers have to work to 70 or anything of that nature. We need to recognise that some occupations, admittedly a decreasing proportion of the workforce, are in hard labour areas and their bodies will wear out.
Yes, indeed. Though I think the interesting thing that Darren made the point was that there's a whole bunch of programs that are actually trying to get those older workers back into alternative jobs. So you might be worn out, you know, like my brother-in-law is a drainer, his knees went. And then he discovered he didn't get the pension at 65, he gets it at 65 and a half. But is that the sort of the main strategy that the government has at the moment to deal with those kinds of, the people whose bodies are worn out, is to retrain them to do something else?
So I think there's probably a number of elements of the government's programs. There's certainly programs about the reskilling and remaining in the workforce, but for those, you know, there are other support programs where you're not able to remain in the workforce at all. So, yeah, disability pension, for example, for those who can't re-enter.
Now, I'm sure there's lots of burning questions out there. Yes, over here. Just if you could use the microphone, please, because we are recording this session, so.
Hi, thanks. Just to pick up your renting question, and just really to David, you know, perhaps one of the real issues is not just the average, because although we are interested in the middle and upper classes, but in terms of vulnerability of this, you know, we do have a lot in Australia who not in public housing and are renting. Would we be unusual in that, or is it quite common across the world, OECD particularly?
In terms of home ownership, this is actually one of the questions we look at. The whole issue of how you define home ownership around the world is an interesting one, even to get comparable data. But I absolutely agree that the highest level of poverty amongst the age is amongst private renters, and many of them are women. So I think that is part of the poverty alleviation component of the first pillar, and I think our rental assistance is inadequate in that space at the moment. And certainly part of housing security, if you like, is what we should be thinking about for a dignified retirement. If you own your own home, fine. If you don't, we want to make sure you're not paying 60% of the age pension in rent or something like that. So, very valid.
Down here. Can you use the microphone?
David, Mark Cure. I'm just wondering, when you do your adequacy test, sustainability, do you look at the value of the family home? We know the way the tax system works in Australia encourages people to overinvest in their homes. That's a store of wealth that's reasonably tax efficient, as long as there's capital growth. So it's a key element of the store of wealth of retired Australians, and it's also a major disadvantage for those who don't have that store of wealth because they get penalised on rent. But do you look at that? Is that part of your equation? And what policy initiatives do you really suggest in that area? And you've got to be brave.
No, we don't look at the value of the home. Getting objective international data on that is very hard. We have a very simple question on level of home ownership in each country and level of household debt. Now, that's not perfect, but I take the point too that what we want to concentrate on is the median. I think Peter made that point, not the average. The reason we look at the average at the moment is that the OECD stopped producing numbers for the median. But Helen Rowell of APRA suggested the other day that we should actually start looking at distributions. And the OECD does produce, net replacement rates for 50% of the average wage, 100% and 150. Let's leave 200 out of it. And if we look at that distribution and do a little bit of weighting, Australia will come out better because the low income earners at 50% of the average wage, and many people, although they won't have 50% throughout their career, they'll be in and out of the workforce, so they'll be closer to that mark. The age pension does help under its current rules for that group. So that's certainly something we'll be looking at next year with the steering committee, of doing some sort of weighting for the net replacement rate rather than just take the average.
Can I just make a comment about that? Recently, of course, every year the Credit Suisse come out with their global wealth report, and people get surprised most years that Australia has the highest median wealth in the world. I think they use exchange rates for the rather than purchasing power parities or anything like that. The main reason why Australia pretty consistently comes out with the highest median wealth in the world is home ownership amongst the elderly.
Which is 60% of the wealth in the
Yeah, and we have much higher share of wealth in home ownership than a lot of other countries. So the Credit Suisse does have, well, it certainly has aggregate wealth, and I think for some countries they have a breakdown by housing wealth. The complexity, again, there's a lot of observations about how do you take account of the family home and the assets test and things like this, is that the distribution of wealth is a product of a very long period of time. So that shifting wealth is not the same as shifting income. I mean, you can have taxes on wealth, obviously, more so than we have here, but it's not. It is actually a very complicated thing, in the sense that arguably both our level of home ownership has developed over a very long period of time, partly due to policies after the Second World War, but also it's a sort of a natural result of the interaction with the nature of our pension system, that people have more money left over to save for retirement, they have more money to put into housing, and they have less generous public pensions. So there's this sort of production of our unusual nature of our distribution of wealth and income in retirement.
John, and then up the back.
Yeah, this is a really interesting discussion. I was actually going to
take issue with David.
That's all right.
And I was going to go back to his first slide, which had 5 pillars, right? And he began with that, and then he talked about his 3 major questions, and he related those to different pillars. And it seems to me that at a high level, you've really got to look at the interaction between the pillars. So to take one example, he said, well, actually our taper rate is 50%. It's quite a shallow taper rate. And this means that a lot of people in the middle range of incomes don't have the same incentive to save as people do in countries where the taper rate is higher. But actually, what we do to compensate for that is insist that they save through mandatory superannuation. So we've got a compensating mechanism in another pillar. And I think it's quite important to appreciate the way in which these pillars interact. I'm in favour of tough pillars. And while we're on pillars, I think the assets test, I don't know whether it needs to be moderated. I do think that assets give people discretionary economic power that's different from income. And so it's appropriate to think about having means tests on both. The fact that no other country does it, I think, just shows how dumb all the others are.
Would you like to respond to that, Dave?
Another example, I think, it relates to housing, and I know you've just been talking about housing. So housing appears in the far right column. That's the 5th column. It's numbered pillar number 4 because the World Bank can't count, really. over on the right. But that interacts very heavily with adequacy. Right? And so we've just been hearing about how we have much higher levels of home ownership in Australia. So if you look at the OECD figures on poverty in retirement in Australia, they actually look quite bad. But if you do a calculation, as Raf Holmick has done in our briefs, which appear out the front, and you look at what happens after taking account of housing costs, you can either impute the housing in or you can remove everything. That rate comes down to something like the OECD average. I think it's 8 or 9 or 10%, something like that. You could obviously do better, but it's not the 3rd worst in the OECD. And so, again, it's a question of relating, it's a question of looking at the interaction between the pillars and thinking about both incentives and equity in coming up with an overall assessment. So I was wondering whether the panel would have a reaction to that.
Thanks, John. I absolutely agree that interaction between the pillars is really important, and I think I did some work a couple of years ago on countries who have what is the objective of their retirement income system. And our government has talked about the objective of super without actually defining the objective of the system as a whole, or indeed the objective of the pension. We've got to talk about the objective of the total system. Absolutely agree with that. I think, do we have 2 tests or 1 test? I agree with you that assets and income are both part of that context, but I think there's no reason why we can't deem income on assets, including the family home above a certain level, to actually bring that into a simpler one-off test rather than have 2 tests with people jumping around. So we can have a discussion on the appropriate taper rates and all that sort of thing. I think the really important thing is that whatever the interaction is, the outcomes drive appropriate behaviour by people before retirement and after retirement. And I'm not sure the current system does that in Australia.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I'll just make a quick observation. I mean, while this is not about the adequacy of the basic level of the age pension, pretty clearly from the recent findings of the Royal Commission and related material, one of the biggest ways of improving adequacy of incomes in retirement is to reduce administrative charges and get a better, so I mean, I think there's a lot more in terms of improving adequacy for middle income people in the long run. That should be a big area of focus.
I'll just pick up the point about the assets test. I think the point that you made, John, partly goes to the government's changes a couple of years ago, and that was part of the motivation, the view that if you've got assets that you should draw on those first before you seek to draw on the sort of public benefits. So it's a question of whether you can retain that idea as part of a sort of broader simplification process too. I think it's...
Okay. First, Ralph. And I'll just like to point out that Ralph and Jane, who's sitting next to him, Jane headed up the team on the super inquiry at the Productivity Commission, and Ralph is the head of the Canberra office here. So they've got a lot of useful things to say about this, I'm sure.
Maybe, with less familiarity perhaps with some of the details. But one of the questions goes to the issue of the asset and income test. So over time, as I understand it, the indexation of those tests is CPI based, whereas the pension is based on real wage growth. So in the longer run, the taper will decreasingly play a role because the assets will climb at a rate, as has been indicated, like 5, 6, 7%, while the CPI is going to be well below that. So people have comments on what the long-run indexation arrangements will do and whether they think, in fact, government will regard them as sustainable as part of retirement policy.
So I think the point you make is right, but also I think we also see that governments periodically will come in and amend thresholds. So we saw, 2 years ago, the government raised the threshold for the assets test. So I think you're right about the long run trend. The question is what other decisions do government take through the, over time.
Yeah, I'd add to that. I think there's always a political process in that, and there'll be ad hoc adjustments in leading up to elections or whatever it might be. We'll see that possibly with the level of the age pension over time. We'll see it with means assets tests. So I'm not sure the indexation rules will apply for 20 years without adjustment.
Can I just make an observation on that? I think it was people in the UK pointed out, in the long run, how you index pensions is one of the most important determinants of how adequate they're going to be. So while I'm certain governments will want to adjust things from time to time, and that's in many respects, one of the advantages of our system, that it's more easily adjustable than something which is based on people's contributions for a very long period of time, if you move too far away from wage indexation, you end up with all sorts of messes. The UK system is a wonderful example of that. Mrs Thatcher changed the indexation of pensions back in the early 80s, and basically it's taken them getting on towards 40 years to basically reverse that, and in the process creating incredibly complicated changing systems. So while I think short-term adjustments to indexation are very likely, governments, if they have that power, will have budgetary requirements from year to year. I think in the long run, we need to make sure that we keep indexation that maintains living standards with the rest of the community.
I think there might be people who would apply that comment to New Start too, possibly. But anyway, Ian.
Ian Yates from Coded. Two observations and a question. One observation is about the assets test taper rate and to observe, in fact, that particular decision to go to the 3 from the 150 was the outcome of a political firestorm about indexation. And it was a trade-off and it was a deal done, and it was done in the way it was done for two reasons. One is it seemed easier to go back to something that had been policy for a long time, and B, the Greens were going to pass it. So the question was, could we do a deal on the way through the Senate, which we did in terms of other superannuation stuff. But I think if you look at it more objectively, I agree, I've always agreed with David that the $3 is too tough. But I think that some objective work that's going to come out soon is going to indicate that it's closer to the 3 than the 150. And partly because of the comments that have been made. So, there's that interaction of real politics and theory in this process. My second observation is in relation to the value of the home. And notwithstanding the accepted commentary that this will always be politically unacceptable, our experience in our constituency is that while putting the whole value of the home is not going to happen, that a recognition of inequities is becoming more widespread out there in ordinary front bar land, if you like, in pub test land, that, you know, people are understanding that it's not fair that people with the same overall value have different outcomes in terms of public policy. My third question is, no one's mentioned in terms of challenges facing the system, is what do people think we ought to be doing in relation to the movement of the rate of compulsory superannuation guarantee from 9.5 to 12?
Who'd like to pick that one up?
So I think, the only comment I'll make on that is I think it's bipartisan policy from both sides, the move from 9.5 to 12, and I think that's legislated. So I think by and large that's locked in.
I've been a supporter for some years of going to 12. I think that if we got the interaction between the pillars right, which we've talked about already, then a movement from 9.5 to 12 would increase retirement income. And what we're really talking about here is consumption smoothing over your lifetime. You've got to move some of the income you earned in your working years to your retirement years. You can argue the toss as to whether it's 9.5 or 12. I think 12 is a better number than 9.5 long term.
Any other comment on that one? The gentleman, the lady, and then up the back.
I'll just preface my question with a comment that this is a fantastic discussion, but it's like trying to run with one leg, because we only are talking about one leg of ageing and the consequences of increasing longevity. If we start to focus on how long people live, you look at a 65-year-old who's got 17 years out of the 20 remaining, on average, where they are able and independent. But we need to focus on the consequences of that, particularly those who are less able and more dependent, because the cost is going to be dramatically higher than we're expecting. We're keeping people alive for much longer, but in a less independent state. So to hear the discussion on income and retirement income is a bit like losing sight of the circumstances in which people will be living. Now, I'm just wondering the extent to which the modelling of adequacy takes account of the quality of life and the health costs which the community is going to be facing from keeping very large numbers of people alive. They're not going to live that much longer. The census shows us that from 85 onwards, people are dying earlier. They're not living as long from 85 onwards, and you get to 100 from 10 years of the last census period, the 10 years going back to, there's a 27% drop in the life expectancy of a 100-year-old person. Doesn't sound like much. A lot of people are going to be in those 85 to 100 spaces. So if we ignore this as part of our policy, we are going to find ourselves with some very major consequences. Now, if people can live for 17 of the 20 years, why shouldn't we have a more needs-based approach to retirement income policy rather than an age-based one?
Okay, while you're thinking about that, I think I'll take the other two questions out there and then have you answer, because just in the sake of time.
Well, my question, in fact, relates very closely to the issue that's just been raised and the extent to which we're looking at adequacy in terms of what you have to spend on. And the vexed question of funding of aged care, I'm not quite sure the pensioner loan scheme is going to be very appealing. It also runs the complication of having the government holding debts against people's property that is currently used to fund aged care, but in fact the government pays the accommodation supplement for half the residents in aged care. So the idea that everybody's got all these assets that they can pour in, that has not really changed over the last 25 years. So there's a whole set of issues around that area, but I'm wondering with Japan, that didn't appear to do well, if you took into account their long-term care insurance, where contributions continue through retirement, which would catch a lot of our high-income superannuants, whether that would change the picture in Japan and Germany or any of the other countries that have a compulsory long-term care insurance scheme, and whether, instead of just raising the super contribution, which would affect a lot of young, low-income people, whether we should be looking at a tax or a levy on superannuation fund earnings above a certain threshold, balance above a certain threshold, and carry it right through post-retirement to pay for aged care.
Thank you. And then up the back, and then we'll give the panel a chance to answer these rather good questions.
Hi, guys. The Productivity Commission, in its supplementary paper last Friday and its interim report on superannuation, both made points about the SMSF sector and sort of the low returns in small balance funds there. I'm just wondering, with the growth in that sector so large, particularly for Darren, is this something Treasury is thinking about? And I guess for Peter and David, should it be thinking about the interaction between the SMSF sector outcomes and the age pension?
Okay, so we've got a question on what do we do about the very old and the fact that we are maybe keeping people alive, but maybe we're not. I hadn't heard that data from the census. Also on Japan and the issues around aged care insurance, and then one about the whole question of those super balances. Who'd like to start off?
So there's a lot there. So maybe I'll just start with the first question or first two questions. So looking at the whole system as a whole, a very valid point. So in Treasury, we try and do that with the IGR, which is a generational report we put out every 5 years, which tries to look at the system as a whole. So health, aged care, the retirement, and how they all interact. So that's an important point. Again, looking at the system as a whole, the government's sort of package at the budget, the more choices for a longer life, did try and look at all of those different dimensions. So it had a health, it had the aged care, it had the financial security elements, again, trying to look at all of the elements. And I think that's part of the reason why there was a move towards more home care packages. I think bringing up some of the points you make about how you age and what that really looks like. I think there's a point over here about should you have a surcharge on your earnings? In a way, I think the government's effectively implemented that with the transfer balance cap. So at retirement now, there's a $1.6 million transfer balance cap. So any amount above that doesn't qualify for the tax-free earnings in retirement, and therefore you pay a 15% earnings rate of tax. So in a way, so I think that's partly been done. Shall I answer why don't we finish that and come back to the SMSF one?
Okay, that sounds good.
Look, I agree with the questions on taking a holistic view on aged care, pharmaceuticals, health costs, long-term care, etc. I'll just have an excuse for our global index. It's incredibly difficult to get objective data on those questions from different countries. We're actually trying to do it through the Actuaries Institute a little bit at the moment, just on 6 countries. And I've sent to some colleagues, can you give me some details of your aged care rules, if you like? Too hard, can't summarise them in a page or whatever. It's incredibly difficult space. It's a moving space. I think we certainly have to have a look at it, but to get comparable data from around the world is very difficult. That's not to say we shouldn't look at it in Australia. And I think we've got there's almost a series of means tests as well. It's not only the means test on the age pension, you've got in effect a means test on pharmaceuticals, you've got a means test when it comes into nursing home and such like. So it's, sorry? 3 in aged care. 3 in aged care, thank you, Ian. So it's actually very complicated, and does it all make sense when you put them together? I don't know.
Peter?
I was just going to make an observation about aged care, and I agree entirely. I think that it worries me that we are underestimating the future costs, because what's happening is both that we do seem to be getting improvements in life expectancy, but also we yet have the baby boom generation to reach the ages at which they become much more likely to use aged care. Rather paradoxically, perhaps, while we've got currently about the 4th cheapest pension system in the OECD, we've got about the 4th highest spending on aged care. And we're a long way behind the Nordic countries, but we're still about number 4. And I think that, again, that reflects one of those unusual historical, sort of determinants of our system, that government started funding nursing homes back in the 1950s, and we built a lot of them, as far as I can see. And so I think that, getting that interaction right and thinking about how we pay for it, and whether, in fact, while this is difficult, whether we actually need a completely different funding model that's more like a European funding model that actually addresses, the recurrent costs that it requires for a home or whatever institution to adequately support people at different stages of care needs. Maybe we need a completely different approach to that than the one we currently have. But I'm not particularly an expert in it, but it seems to me it is one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face, not in the next decade necessarily, but 20 or 30 years from now.
Again, you wanted to pick up the point about self-managed super, right?
Yeah, so the PC. So I think the PC report has a number of laid out a number of findings that are worthy of reflection and thought, and that includes the SMSF one. I guess the challenge there is that we've always had this principle of choice, so that people can make their own choices and it's self-determination. But I guess with the SMSF issue, it's tied up a bit with advice, which we've seen before the Royal Commission about, potentially the impact of conflicted advice. So I think your first best, policy response to that is to target the problem. If it's advice, then you sort of want to focus on that. And we'll certainly wait and see where the Royal Commission goes with its findings, and certainly look at it in that context. But whether there's something broader we need to think about, then certainly I think government will do that in response to both the Productivity Commission report when we see the final and the Royal Commission report.
I think Darren's hit the nail on the head with the word choice. While we have choice out there, whether it's investment choice, fund choice, people can make a lot of decisions. Many people don't, so I think a good default system is important. And yet we know that there are many people with SMSFs who should not have them. They've got poor returns, high costs. So is there a framework or ruling somehow that said, unless your balance is above X dollars, you shouldn't have one? That's just one option. The other issue with SMSFs is clearly the members are trustees, and some of these members are now moving into their 80s and 90s with cognitive decline, and there's an issue there. So I think there are issues in that space. I'm not saying we should get rid of SMSFs, but we need to be aware of some of the framework issues.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. I think this has been really insightful. I think it's conversations like this that put all the issues on the table that help policymakers to actually sort out what you can and can't do. Even just the fight over taxing super beyond the 1.6 mil was very hard fought. So clearly policy reforms in this area are quite challenging. But thank you all for your contributions, and I think we'd very much like to thank our panel members, Peter, Darren and David, for some really, really interesting presentations and conversation today. Thank you.